The bright side of addiction is recovery. And recovery begins with hope. Hi, everyone. I'm Neil Scott. If you're new to our podcast, we welcome you. And if you have been here before, welcome back. And if you are in recovery or know or love someone who is, or simply want to know more about the recovery process, or maybe you're a bit concerned about someone you know or love who is harmfully using alcohol or any other drug, this is the podcast for you. We carry the message of hope and the promise of recovery. And a reminder, you can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. Recent episodes have featured interviews with rock and roll legend Dion DiMucci from Dion and the Belmonts, rock and roll icon Bonnie Raitt, astronaut Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon, Grammy Award winner Judy Collins, and more. Plus, conversations with everyday people in long-term recovery. You're going to meet one of them today, sharing their story, their insight, their path. In this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, an informal chat with Toby H, a high-bottom alcoholic and a former professor at Harvard and other major universities. He stayed sober 10 years before finally falling into and embracing the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. It completely changed his life, his thinking, and his feelings. He also has a daughter who has been sober for 15 amazing years. Here's a quick clip from today's podcast.
It is gratitude personified. I was miserable, and now I'm not. Even though I had all these trappings of success, I was unhappy. I didn't have a life. Now I have a life. Getting better. Recovery is such a wonderful opportunity. And these opportunities to tell one story and the possibility of it helping just one other suffering alcoholic is plenty of reason to explore it and to find out what sort of life changes can occur.
My conversation with Toby coming right up. And we'll conclude our podcast with some thoughts on recovery from iconic actor and a guy in really long-term recovery, the great Dick Van Dyke. Our website is recoverycoasttocoast.org. If you would like to help us out financially or know of a foundation or maybe a company that might be interested in underwriting our program, we would be ever so grateful. A reminder, our email address is recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. We'd love to hear from you, and we appreciate you listening today. Recovery Coast to Coast is supported by the good folks at Sundown M Ranch. Now, they're one of America's oldest, least expensive, and most successful treatment programs. They're actually listed in Newsweek magazine's recent list of America's top treatment providers. I was recently over in Yakima, which is where Sundown is, for their 35th annual Merrill Scott Symposium, sponsored by Sundown M Ranch. I had a chance to spend some time with some of their amazing staff. They are wonderful. And the staff defines the program. Don't get blindsided by fancy marketing, including, the promise of a resort-like atmosphere with swimming pools and sauna and big screen TVs. Treatment for addiction is not a vacation. Far from it. It's potentially life-saving. And the decision that you make on where you receive the treatment is paramount. Sundown has been successfully treating adults, adolescents, and family members, for the past 57 years. Their longevity and success speaks for itself. And they make the treatment experience a compassionate and rewarding one. Their staff is top-notch. They are a not-for-profit program, so they are more concerned with the patient's long-term recovery than actually filling a bed and making a financial profit. And they are one of the most affordable addiction programs in the country. You can find out a lot more about Sundown M Ranch by visiting their website, sundown.org, where you can view their program, their history, and their facility, which is located in central Washington, not too far from Seattle. I believe Sundown is one of the best treatment programs in the country. I encourage you to do your homework. Addiction treatment is a big decision, but please consider Sundown M Ranch in your search. It's where recovery begins. Sundown.org. Well, it's time for conversation and coffee. And a conversation today with a guy in long term recovery and a proud member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And at his request, and in keeping with the traditions of AA, we only use first names, which today we're calling Toby Toby. Now, here is my conversation with Toby H. How long have you been in recovery, Toby?
My sobriety date was October 6th, 1990.
1990.
So, yeah, so I had 35 years. Chunk of it dry when I was most miserable.
Yeah. So you're a newcomer then with 35 years.
Yeah, I'm a newcomer for 35 years. Yeah.
Well, I always say the person who got up earliest this morning has the most sobriety because it's all about today.
Yes, I will agree with that.
Well, take me back then to the 1980s, if you will, and what led you into this new life of recovery. How bad did it get for Toby?
Big Book says no matter how far down the scale we have gone, you will see how our experience can benefit others. And I've always read that sentence to mean that there's a place for me, even though I never got stuck with a DUI. I never lived under a bridge. My how far down the scale was a pretty high bottom. I was one of these people who was pushed really hard by a mother who had lost everything. She was earlier in her life, and she was going to see hell or high water that her son was not going to end up that way. So she pushed me really hard, and it worked. So I was one of these people who found all sorts of success all through my life. I'm not the biggest guy in the world, and my mother taught me that if you're small or you're not so smart, you just got to work harder and study later and do more push-ups to have success. And so I had a very blessed life. I left home when I was 13 years old, got a scholarship, went to a fancy prep school on the East Coast. There wasn't anything it seemed that I couldn't do well enough to kind of get ahead and quote, distinguish myself from others.
When did the drinking start for you, Toby?
I lived in Sausalito, California, and my parents had their liquor cabinet underneath the kitchen sink. There was chocolate vodka there, and I thought I'd sneak a chocolate vodka every now and then, and if I filled the bottle back, they'd never know. Probably 10.
10 years old?
Yeah.
Wow.
Underneath the kitchen sink, and I wasn't paying attention to the color of the chocolate vodka, so I eventually got outed. But I did a lot of sports at that school, and I couldn't travel all the way back to California for vacations most of the time, and so I'd go to friends' houses and stuff. So it started in mid-high school. I was always a blackout drinker even from that age. So I would do sports and go on the wagon, and on vacation I'd drink. Got into fancy schools. I went to Stanford where the drinking got really bad. Continued through college.
Did it affect your grades?
No, I always sort of titrated my drinking against performance that I demanded of myself. So, the pattern was I would work, do all my homework, stay up till 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and then go out to bars with fraternity brothers and drink until they closed, drive drunk back. So anyway, I was one of these people that had essentially everything. I didn't have a lot of money, but, lots and lots of success. I worked incredibly hard, but I drank incredibly hard as well. Career thing, I went off to do postdoctoral fellowships in Europe, lived in Switzerland, lived in Stockholm, Sweden for a year, went back and taught at Stanford for a number of years, drinking all the time, doing crazy things like drinking and doing triathlons at the same time. So if I drank a little more than yesterday, I had to ride my bike more. Insane life. Very successful academic career. Ended up teaching at Harvard. From the outside, it looked like I was the measure of every success anybody could ever imagine, and yet it never worked. I was always trying to get to the next place, to the next fancier job, to the fancier car, better house.
When did you realize that your life was basically unmanageable?
Well, I wasn't happy. I never just stopped. And I was anxious, I think, all the time is the way it felt. That I had to get the next paper out. I had to get the next grant from NIH. I had to get the next fancy position at the medical school. I had to run the hospital, on and on. It was just always either acquisition or trying to rise above or distinguish myself. I think the achievement of my life is the sentence in the big book that says, the phrase is, we know only a little. And that's the way I have come to feel, all because of Alcoholics Anonymous, all because of the fellowship, all because I learned that I wasn't the center of the universe. I had to first learn that I didn't have to be the center of the room. I didn't have to talk all the time.
So what happened in the week of October 6th back in 1990? What led you into the rooms? What was your first meeting like? What were the events that surrounded that?
Beautiful question. I was at a prep school reunion, and I was actually in charge of organizing it. We set up kind of classes for people. Decided to set up a class that was around recovery. I wasn't in recovery, didn't know anything about it. Oh, there was a guy named Scott Bradford who was a drug addict. He's now long gone, and an alcoholic. He'd been kicked out of school, and he came back to reunion, and I thought we should have Brad lead a class. And he did, and he said that he couldn't imagine not drinking for the rest of his life, but he could imagine not drinking until midnight that day. And I'd heard that sort of thing hundreds of times, and I was ready to hear that day. That night, I was staying at a little inn in this town, and I always kept a case of warm Rolling Rock in the trunk of my car in case I couldn't find booze. And I dragged my warm case of Rolling Rock up the back stairs of that little inn, sat there in front of a black and white TV watching some football game from deep in the South, and polished off most of that case of beer. We had a church meeting the next day, and my friend Scott Bradford was a jazz pianist, and he was playing the piano in honor of some of our classmates who have died, and this ray of sunshine came through the stained glass window and shone on Scott Bradford playing the piano. And that night before was my most recent drink, 35 years ago. I didn't see it as a burning bush experience, but that was my last drink.
How did you know what to do? How did you know where to go? How did you reach out?
Scott talked about it. He, in a sense, talked about recovery and talked about Alcoholics Anonymous. I happened to live on a cul-de-sac in Lincoln, Massachusetts, and one of my neighbors was a person who started a meeting in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that still survives all these years later. I also knew that my uncle was an alcoholic, incredibly attractive, magnetic man, just wonderful person, except every 3 or 4 months he'd steal a car and be gone for 2 or 3 months, getting thrown in jail, and then he'd come back. My uncle ended up, interesting story, he ended up getting sober in his 60s, ran a couple of recovery houses, and just became famous in Sacramento for saving the lives of many people. But anyway, I called my uncle. He was shocked, crazy, because, I had such a successful life that nobody could believe that I was an alcoholic. I called them both. My neighbor took me to a meeting in a nearby town. Many knew. All I saw were the differences. There were people there that addict. They ate chocolate cake, and here I was training for triathlon. I was offended or put off by the whole idea, and that started 10, 11 years of not drinking, dry life, in which I was the most miserable probably of my entire life. By knuckling it and acting out because I felt terrible and I didn't have anything to numb the feelings with, got to, after more successful career stuff, ended up falling in love with someone and left Harvard to live with her in Oregon, and somehow ended up in the Coral House.
What is the Coral House?
The Coral, C-O-R-L, Coral House. It used to be a farmhouse, and it's a meeting room, and groups can rent. You know, at first it was very uncomfortable for me, sort of outing myself, but I came to realize that there were people there that had found peace, that lived with grace, that cared more about others than themselves. I wanted what they had. So I threw myself into the program with typical vigor, I suppose you'd say about me, and learned to shut up, learned to listen, started working with a sponsor. I was one of these people that was last in and first out, sat by the door, didn't know. I was scared to talk to alcoholics. What do you say to an alcoholic without embarrassing that person or yourself? After time, working with other alcoholics became essentially my life's work. I have learned more, found more peace and serenity sitting across the table from another alcoholic than I ever learned in teaching for 50 years at these fancy schools, writing papers and books and all this kind of stuff. My place is across the table from another alcoholic, watching them start to understand that there's hope. It's kind of a paradox. The best thing that's ever happened to me in my life was the discovery that I was an alcoholic and that there was hope. And I could have that hope and I could give that hope. I could find a better version of me. I could find a higher power. As an aside, you can't hardly imagine what a God fighter I was. Typical academic, I had to read all these books on how to talk to God. And one day I just was talking to God. It's been a really blessed life. It's really in my old age. This all happened, that I found that I didn't have to climb uphill all the time.
It keeps on giving. That's the beautiful thing of recovery. I often say that just as alcoholism is progressive in a negative sense, recovery should be progressive in a positive sense. So tell me, Toby, you've been in recovery 35 years. How is your recovery different today than it was, say, 3 or 4 years ago?
I go to Zoom meetings now that I didn't do 3 or 4 years ago, and that's been an incredible gift. You can just sit down in your front room and have 50 people there with you. One of the most beautiful things about my life today is that I have ceased fighting anything or anyone. This isn't so much distinguishing 3 or 4 years ago, but in my earlier life, I woke up ready to fight. I got up and read the New York Times in order to have arguments with people. I don't have to take a position. I don't have to defend myself. I used to think I owned hiking trails, that anybody that was there on the hiking trail with me was an intruder. I don't feel like that anymore, I welcome seeing these people and smiling face. I can go to a store and talk to the counter person or talk to the person next to me in line and smile, and it's a heck of a good life, I must say. And I have so many people to thank. All the sponsees, all the people in the room, my first sponsor. They've been so important to me. The other thing the program has given me is my daughter has gone through 2 really tough periods of addiction. It was probably the most difficult period of my life. I thought I could control it. I couldn't do any of that. I had to be prepared to let her go. And somehow once that happened, that sense that I could not help even, and there seemed to be more room in our collective lives to have regard for one another. And she eventually got into recovery, and she's got 15 years.
Wow. You must be pretty proud of her. She's got 15 years now in recovery. That must be
God.
Oh, wow.
We say we will not regret the past. That was the most difficult part of my past. And we look back on these things just with horror. And the strange thing is that's what I have to give away now. Those experiences in our past that were our most painful are we get to give away to keep it.
Talk to me about gratitude.
I couldn't be more grateful, I don't think, everything I've been telling you, talking about, every time I share in a meeting, it is gratitude personified. I was miserable and now I'm not. Even though I had all these trappings of success, I was unhappy. I didn't have a life. Now I have a life.
You've been in recovery 35 years. What does recovery mean to you today? Can you put it into words?
Well, I can tell you one thing. I think I was for most of my life blinded by self. I see other people now. I get to have empathy for other people. I'm a better father. Still not the best brother in the world, but getting better. Recovery is such a wonderful opportunity. And these opportunities to tell one story and the possibility of it helping just one other suffering alcoholic is plenty of reason to explore it and to find out what sort of life changes can occur if you do the work and share your story with others.
I often say that recovery is living proof, and you, Toby, are living proof. And recovery begins with hope. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Toby, living life on life's terms in the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And by the way, I want to remind listeners of this podcast that if you would like to tell your story of recovery, regardless of the path you've chosen, and as long as you have been in continuous recovery for a year or more, drop us a note at recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Coming up next, actor Dick Van Dyke reminds all of us that in recovery, anything can happen. That's coming up in 30 seconds.
Are you afraid? Afraid of life without drugs and alcohol? There is help and hope at Sundown M Ranch. At Sundown, the focus is on you and your disease. You will learn how to live without depending on drugs and alcohol. Sundown M Ranch is nationally recognized for effective and affordable alcohol and drug treatment programs. Reclaim your life. Replace your fears with hope. Go to www.sundown.org right now to learn more.
And now, as promised, some interesting comments from actor Dick Van Dyke with an interesting take on recovery.
Better shun the bait than struggle in the snare. John Dryden. When I was still drinking, I always identified with the messages in liquor ads. Even at the end, drinking cheap red wine by the gallon and sleeping on the beach, I was unwilling to let go of the idea of drinking as glamorous, romantic, and sophisticated. That's how strong my denial was. Even in sobriety, these ads can be seductive. However, when my mind occasionally and briefly veers off the track these days, it doesn't take much thought for me to come back to the reality of my alcoholism. I was driving along the freeway one day, for example, and saw a huge billboard advertising a brand of tequila. For a second or two, I was captivated by the full shot glass, the exotic and colorful background. As I recall, there were a garland of tropical flowers and a parrot in flight. But most captivating of all was the printed headline, "Anything can happen." Naturally, those words mean something entirely different to me than to normal drinkers. When I read them that day, I almost immediately thought of alcoholic blackouts, of coming to in unfamiliar surroundings, of realizing that I was in jail and not knowing why. When I read those words, "Anything can happen," I was reminded that if I pick up a drink, no matter what my motive or rationalization, there's no way of knowing or predicting what will happen to me. Thought for today: when I take the first drink, pill, snort, anything can happen.
Well, that wraps up this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. And if you've enjoyed our podcast, please share it with at least one other person. We'd certainly appreciate it. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, our email again, recoverycoasttocoast, one word, at comcast.net. And please hit the subscribe or follow button. It's free, and you'll be notified the next time we publish a podcast. If you're considering treatment for a friend or a loved one, be sure to visit NAATP.org/AID. That's the Addiction Information Directory, a list of those treatment programs that adhere to the strict ethical guidelines. One of them is Sundown M Ranch, but there are thousands of other good treatment programs around as well. And join us next time for America's Voice for Recovery, Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. And another shout out to our sponsoring organization, Sundown M Ranch, where recovery begins. Sundown.org. I'm Neil Scott, reminding you to stay healthy, live in gratitude, be kind to others. Remember, the bright side of addiction is recovery. Pass it on.